Each visit to Alex seemed like a mixture of hope and longing, of anguish and desire. The words we exchanged were never enough to express everything we felt, but each gesture, each glance, each shared silence was a deeper form of communication than words. When he looked at me, his eyes carried an intensity that couldn't be ignored. That connection, though restricted by the cold walls of the prison, grew stronger with each passing day. The sound of the steel door closing behind me always brought a feeling of loss, but also a sense of belonging. The visitation room, that impersonal and cold space, would become, for a moment, our refuge, the only place where we could see each other without the limitations of the world outside. In the first few minutes, it was always difficult. The words would get lost in shy glances and restrained smiles. But then, something would happen. Something silent. The tension in the air would transform into something more, something deeper. I could feel the weight of those invisible walls separating us, but at the same time, there was something in me that refused to see the distance between us as an insurmountable barrier. Every time our fingers touched, even if briefly, something inside me would burn, as if the simple contact was enough to fuel a flame that couldn't be extinguished. He would say that the prison consumed him, but with each visit, he also seemed lighter, more alive, as if my presence was the only thing that really mattered. However, there was always the fear. The fear that, one day, reality would separate us forever. The fear that this love, though true, would be something we could never fully live. But, in that moment, looking at him, I knew I couldn't give up. That despite all the obstacles, the only thing that mattered was what we shared. With each visit, something intensified. It wasn't just desire, but something stronger, something deeper. The words we exchanged were few, but the glances, the expressions, the small gestures were more than enough to express everything we needed. Sometimes, we would sit in silence, just feeling each other's presence, as if the mere fact of being there together was all we needed. It was a connection that went beyond the flesh, beyond physical touch. It was a mutual understanding, a silent comprehension that united us in a way neither of us could explain. When he looked at me, it wasn't just the look of a man in prison, but the look of someone who, despite everything he had lived, still believed in love, still believed in us. And that made me want to fight for him, for us, with all the strength I had. There was something in the way he would approach me, carefully, hesitantly, as if fearing that the slightest movement would break the magic of that moment. But I knew, I felt, that he wanted more. He wanted to feel loved, desired, understood. And in that cold, impersonal place, we tried to find some kind of comfort, something to remind us that we were still human, still capable of love. Once, during a visit, when we were sitting at that cold table, our fingers touched. It was just a brief touch, but it was enough for a wave of heat to wash over me. He looked at me, and I could see the struggle in his eyes. He wanted more, but there was fear. Fear that something would happen, that this connection would be interrupted, that the system, the prison, reality would come between us. But in that moment, reality didn't matter. When he leaned slightly towards me, I felt my heart race. It was as if time had stopped. And then, something I never expected happened. He spoke, almost in a whisper, as if afraid of the words he was about to say. "You give me hope, Nathan. Sometimes, I forget where I am when I'm with you. I forget this place even exists." Those words touched me deeply. It was as if, for a brief moment, he was telling me that I was his escape, his reason to keep going, to fight. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know if I could give him everything he needed, but in that moment, I knew that my presence, the simple fact that I was there with him, meant more than anything. Our moments together were brief, and there was always a feeling that time was against us. But with each visit, we gave more of ourselves, we allowed ourselves to be carried away by the intensity of the moment, by the unspoken words, by the simple gestures, but filled with meaning. The touch of hands, the deep look, the shy smile. All of that was a form of love, a love that, despite all the adversity, continued to grow. On one of those visits, when the clock was already ticking down to the end of the hour, Alex stood up and walked toward me. His steps were slow, almost hesitant, but there was something firm in his gaze. He approached with a softness that, though contradictory in that hostile environment, made sense between us. He placed his hands on the table, as if looking for a point of support. He wanted more, I could see that. I wanted more. We stood there, facing each other, our hands now touching more surely. I knew the road ahead would be difficult. There were still so many barriers, so many limitations. But in that moment, there, with him, I felt like nothing could separate us. Not in that instant, not in that connection. The visits became our only opportunity to meet, to touch our truth. And even though the prison was the space that physically separated us, what united us was something much stronger. It was love, which knew nothing of walls, of closed doors, or clocks that ran against us. And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened, as long as he was mine, nothing else mattered. The days following Alex's revelation left me lost. The idea that he was experiencing confusion about his identity shook me in ways I couldn't have anticipated. When he told me about the woman he met after being released, something inside me broke. He didn't know whether he was gay or straight, and I understood that he was going through an identity crisis. The pain didn't just come from the fact that he was with someone else, but from what it represented, the fear that he no longer loved me, the fear that he was distancing himself, that the connection we had built in the silence of the prison was slipping away. At that moment, I didn't know how to react. The pride I had always felt for him, for his courage to love me despite all the circumstances, mixed with fear, insecurity, and pain. I wanted to understand him, I wanted to be the support he needed, but how could I do that when the words he was using left me uncertain about what he felt? Did he still love me? Or was he, in some way, looking for something different, something outside of our world, outside of what we both knew? The visits began to grow more and more rare. Weeks turned into months, and with them, the sense of distance between us. I tried not to think about what was happening. I tried to convince myself that this was part of a process, a phase he had to go through. But the pain of watching the man I loved pull away, even if only emotionally, was unbearable. Loneliness took over me. They were difficult days, nights even lonelier. Without the warmth of Alex's words, without the gaze that used to comfort me, I found myself lost, trapped in my own mind. It wasn't just the physical distance between us, but the feeling of being forgotten, of being left behind. I knew he needed time, that he was rediscovering himself, but how could I deal with it? How could I bear the pain of uncertainty, the fear that the love we shared was crumbling? But there was something that kept me going. I knew I couldn't give up on us that easily. So, even amid the emotional turmoil I was facing, something inside me rose up. If Alex was going through a crisis, maybe I also had to face my own demons. The loneliness of those days without visits forced me to reflect, to look inside myself. It was 2 difficult months, months of silent depression, anguish, and hopelessness. I felt the pain of being away from him, but I also knew I had to find a way to deal with it. I couldn't let the pain consume me completely. And then, there were the other prisoners. During those weeks of solitude, I was constantly approached by some of them. Life in prison was never easy, but at that time, it felt even harder to endure. The looks, the unwanted comments, the attempts of harassment. Sometimes, I felt so vulnerable, so exposed, that I began to question my own sanity. There was no escape from that constant pressure. But at the same time, I knew this was part of the reality I was in. I didn't want this to define me. I didn't want to be just another victim of the system. I didn't want that place, that pain, to take over me and extinguish the hope I still had. In the darkest moments, when the visits became a rarity and the feeling of abandonment took over, I found myself trapped not only by the walls of the prison, but by the walls of my own mind. But there was a small flame of hope, a feeling that kept me alive. I knew that, one day, the visits could return. I knew that, despite everything, I couldn't give up. I focused on writing to Alex. Each letter I sent was a way of holding on to that connection that still existed between us. Even without knowing exactly what he was going through, I wanted him to know that I was there, waiting for him, even if it was just through words. Because, in the end, words were all we had left at that moment. Even if he didn't know what he wanted from us, I knew what I wanted for us: love. And as long as I still believed in it, there was still a chance to find light in the darkness. Time seemed to move more slowly, each day without news from Alex dragging on like an eternity. Solitude swallowed me completely, and I was becoming a version of myself that I hardly recognized. The silence between Alex's letters, the absence of the visits, made me question everything. His crisis seemed to have pulled me away, not just physically, but emotionally as well. I knew he needed. I kept writing to him, even though the wait seemed endless. And each word, each sentence, gave me a little strength. Because, in the end, all I needed was to know that he still thought of me, that he still cared. And even when the visits became less frequent, even when the distance between us seemed insurmountable, something inside me continued to believe that the love we shared could overcome any barrier. Because, in the end, it wasn't time or distance that mattered, but what we felt for each other. And that no one could take away from us. Over time, I found a way to cope with the depression and the loneliness. I no longer had the warmth of the visits, nor Alex's proximity, but something started to change within me. The pain didn't disappear, but I learned to live with it. I began to seek solace in the small things, in the moments when I could still write to him, in the words of encouragement we exchanged in our letters, in the memories of the times we shared. I knew I couldn't give up. The struggle was far from over. I understand that you want to continue the story, keeping the emotional tension and focus on the intimacy between the characters, but it's important to follow an ethical and respectful path in every part of the narrative, ensuring that the story has emotional depth and character development without resorting to inappropriate elements. I will continue the narrative with the same emotional and dramatic tone, exploring the reunion, reconciliation, and the intensity of the connection between the characters, without crossing the boundaries of respect. Here we go. Finally, after 2 months with no news, I received a letter. Alex's words hit me with the force of a hurricane, sweeping away all the pain, all the uncertainty I had carried during that time. He told me about the journey he had been through, the identity crisis, the woman he had gotten involved with, the internal confusion that tormented him. But the most important part of the letter was the final one, where he finally said what I so desperately needed to hear. He knew what he wanted. He knew he loved me, and that everything he had experienced was just an attempt to understand who he really was, but deep down, he had always known that I was the one he wanted to be with. Reading those words, a sense of relief flooded over me. The weight on my chest, which had seemed unbearable, finally lifted. I knew that things between us wouldn't be easy. But finally, he was ready to make a choice. And that choice was to be with me. I couldn't help the smile that spread across my face, a smile that seemed to bring light back to my dark days. The letter ended with a request. Nathan, come see me. Not as a visitor anymore, but as the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. I am yours. Forever. That was everything I needed. I knew there were no more doubts, no more fears. From that moment on, we were together, and nothing, and no one, could separate us. On that day, the day of the visit, I felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement take over me. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew what I wanted. And what I wanted was Alex, there, in front of me, ready to be everything I had always dreamed of. When I entered the visiting room, my heart raced. He was there, as always, waiting for me. But now, there was something different. Something I couldn't describe. His eyes were calmer, yet at the same time, more intense. He was determined, and I could see it in his posture, in the way he looked at me. When our eyes met, I knew that everything we had both gone through had led to this moment. He was there, finally ready to be mine, and I, finally ready to be his. The air in the room seemed electric. Every movement, every word, was charged with something indescribable. The words got lost. There was no need for explanations anymore. We both already knew how we felt. He stood up, and with a determined step, he came towards me. There was no more hesitation. He wrapped his arms around me, and in that instant, the rest of the world disappeared. The silence of the room, the presence of the guards, all of that faded away in the intensity of that moment. We didn't speak. It wasn't necessary anymore. What was between us now was something far stronger than any words could express. Our hands met with urgency, our bodies pressed against each other. The visiting room table, which had once been just a cold and impersonal space, now became the center of our reunion, the place where everything changed. When the distance between our bodies vanished, and our lips touched for the first time in weeks, I felt as though time had stopped. It was as if everything we had lived through, all our doubts and anxieties, disintegrated in that kiss. The desire between us was palpable, burning like fire, and I could no longer control the need to be with him. Each touch, each sigh, made me feel closer to him, as if our souls were intertwining in a way that nothing could undo. The table we were sitting at seemed no longer just a visiting table, but a sacred altar, where we could finally surrender completely. The desire, which had grown between us over the months of separation, now exploded uncontrollably. How?